Hey, welcome. Today we're digging into something pretty fascinating: how different generations of Americans actually show up for their communities. Now, you might think civic duty looks pretty much the same for everybody, right? Well, the reality is this really surprising story, a tale of two generations. So let's get into it. We're going to start with a bit of a mystery. When you look at how younger and older Americans are involved in their communities, you don't just see a few little differences. No, you see something that's almost a perfect mirror image of each other. It's like two groups, participating in society in almost completely opposite ways. And this slide really lays it all out. On one side, you've got younger Americans, and they are all about hands-on community service and volunteering. But on the other side, older Americans are way more focused on traditional political stuff, voting in elections. So the big question is, what's going on here? To figure that out, we first have to agree on what we're even talking about.
Okay, let's get on the same page. The term civic engagement, it gets thrown around all the time, but what does it actually really mean? Because understanding the definition is totally key to unlocking why these generational patterns look so different. The source material gives us this fantastic, really clear definition. It's all about participation. It's not just about, living somewhere. It's about actively working to make things better or to help decide what the future looks like. It's a pretty broad idea, but at its heart, it's all about action and improvement.
And we can break this down even more. Researchers tend to look at this whole thing along two key lines. First, is the action focused on the community, like helping out at a food bank, or is it political, like working for a campaign? And second, are you doing it by yourself or are you doing it with a group? These two dimensions, this is exactly where we see that generational split.
All right, enough of the theory. Let's look at the actual data that shows these patterns out in the wild. This is where that whole mirror image thing really comes into focus. So take voting, for example, a super classic political activity. The trend here is just impossible to miss. Only 19% of the youngest adults voted back in the 2002 election. But look what happens as people get older. That number just skyrockets, up to 56% for middle-aged folks, and then a huge 63% for those 65 and over. So that's one side of our mirror. And this slide, wow, this one really captures the whole picture. So researchers put people into two camps: electoral specialists who are all about politics and civic specialists who are all about community service. Now look at the .NET generation. That's ages 15 to 25. They clearly lean toward being civic specialists. Now look at the mature generation, 55 and up. The numbers are completely flipped. They're more than twice as likely to be electoral specialists. This right here, this is the data that proves the mirror image theory. So the data is pretty clear, right? But that just leads us to the biggest question of all. Why? Why do these two generations come at their civic duty from such opposite directions? I mean, this can't just be random. This quote from the research just hits the nail on the head. It really gets to the cultural vibe. For a lot of older Americans, voting is this core, almost sacred duty. But for many younger people, it feels, less central to actually making a difference. Their energy is going somewhere else, into that more direct, hands-on community work. And here's the thing, that channeling of energy is no accident. Not at all. The super high rate of youth volunteering is actually the direct result of a huge, decades-long effort to build an entire infrastructure that encourages and even rewards community service for young people. So how did this whole system get built? Well, it started back in the 80s when colleges started to care about community service in admissions. That created a really powerful incentive, right? Then in the 90s, the government jumped in with support. And by the 2000s, groups like Campus Compact had built this nationwide network, plugging service right into the college experience. It basically became a powerful pipeline. And the results? They are just staggering. Get this. In just one school year, 1.8 million students at these colleges were involved in service. I mean, just think about that for a second. It's a whole ecosystem built from the ground up to get young people involved in their communities. And here's the really crucial part. There's just no parallel system on this scale to channel older adults into volunteering. So this brings us to a huge opportunity. We've got this generation of experienced, motivated, older Americans who are super engaged politically, but way less so in community service. So how can we tap into this incredible resource for our communities? If there's no big infrastructure for them, what's the secret to unlocking all that potential? Is it some, complicated new program, another big government initiative? Well, the research points to something much, much simpler.
That's it. That's the secret. The single most effective way to get older adults to volunteer is simply to invite them to do it. It almost sounds too simple to be true, but the data is pretty shocking.
And this chart just says it all. Of seniors 55 and over who are actually asked to volunteer, an incredible 84% say yes. The research actually shows they're more likely to say yes when asked than the general adult population. So the willingness is totally there. A lot of times, the only thing missing is just the invitation.
So what this all really points to is a huge shift in thinking. We need to move away from seeing older adults as just people who receive services and really start seeing them as an enormous, experienced resource for all of society. And there are already initiatives, like the next chapter, that are building new ways to connect older adults with these kinds of meaningful opportunities, recognizing their skills as the vital assets they are. And so that leaves us with this final, really powerful question. We have one generation that's deeply engaged in service, and another that's deeply engaged in politics. What could we accomplish if we built the bridges to bring all that wisdom, all that experience, and that civic spirit of older Americans fully into the day-to-day life of our communities? What problems could we solve? It's definitely something for all of us to think about.